Hi guys. So we had to do another one without Mrs. Magera because it just takes a lot of time to make all those videos. So it's a little bit easier if we do it this way. Just every once in a while makes it easier. But this video we're talking about the differences between the North and the South and the causes of the Civil War. So we went from talking about this era of good feeling to the beginning of the United States. Now we're going to talk about the lead up, which is going to lead us to the Civil War. The causes and effects that are going to bring about this war as the country goes from being this united itself apart over this issue of slavery. So let's get going. So sectionalism. As a young nation grew, big differences were beginning to develop between the North and the South. So the northern states and the southern states are beginning to grow very differently as time progressed. So originally they had a lot more in common. But then as time went on, it began to change. And sectionalism is the loyalty to one's region or area. And we'll see that being developed. So people being loyal to the South or loyal to their state and not so much to the country anymore. And that's going to be a big reason that we see this Civil War happen. The big difference, sorry, it's kind of cut off there. I don't know why it does that, but is between urban and rural. All right, the North was very urban, which means they had cities, railroads, telegraphs, very developed. You can see in this picture to my right, these are the railroads in the North. You can see all those are strings of railroads with telegraph poles lining them. But then in the South, you can see it's not so much urban. It's very much more rural, with plantations, farms, stuff like that. Plantations being the biggest part. Cotton, corn, rice are big crops. Or New Orleans was one of the biggest cities in the South, and it had not even a fourth of the population of New York, which was in the North. So the North is really going to the cities, industrialization, kind of like moving to the future, industrializing, while the South is kind of still stuck with their plantation economy. And that's going to be one of the big differences between the North and the South. Slavery. And slavery was by far the biggest difference, the biggest issue between the North and the South, and the definite cause of the Civil War. So, the Missouri Compromise had kept slavery out of most northern states. So most northern states had no slaves in them, while in the South, slavery was rampant. Okay, some states in the South had more slaves than they had white people in them. So they were huge, giant plantations with sometimes almost 100 slaves in them. And this will continue to alienate the side, especially as the North goes more anti-slavery. This abolition movement grows and become more and more anti-slavery, while the South begins to stick hard and hard to the way of life with the slaves. So slavery arguments. There are different arguments for and against slavery. In the North, abolition arguments for the freedom of all slaves. Some would help try to smuggle these slaves into Canada where they'd be free through the Underground Railroad. Why they couldn't keep them in the North? Because even if slavery was outlawed in the North, you still your duty to return escaped slaves. The Fugitive Slave Law made that illegal to keep slaves in the North that had escaped. You had to return them. So they formed this Underground Railroad to try to smuggle them into Canada. And this wasn't, obviously, there wasn't actual trains in the Underground Railroad. It was just a system where they'd be like, hey, at night you're going from this house to this house to this house to this house. So it's like a community that made this link and chain of how to get slaves to the Canada. In the South, some moderates were like, hey, let's gradually try to reduce slavery. Maybe the government can pay some. Maybe we can ship some of them to Africa. A bunch of different ideas, but they saw it as a necessary evil a lot of times, these moderates. But then the Southern radicals really just want it to be over. They want the slaves were property, and the Northerns were taking away their freedom. That you're taking away my freedom to own a slave, which, if you think about it, is quite paradoxical, because the slave, by owning a slave, you're taking away all of his freedom. So how dare I take away your freedom to own a slave? It's it's ridiculous that they would ever claim this. But that's what the Southern radicals claim, is that the Northerners were taking away their freedom and by taking away their slaves. Slavery in the new states. So the United States was growing as well. They had fought a war with Spanish and with Mexico, gained a lot of land. Louisiana Purchase, we talked about, a lot of land. And as the United States was growing, they had to decide what to do with these new states. Are these new states going to be slave states, or are they going to be free states? What are we going to do with these new states? Moderates proposed this idea of popular sovereignty, which let the states decide. So let the states vote, and if a state votes to be slave, then it will be a slave state. If it votes to be a free state, then it will be a free state. This seems like a common sense solution, but you have to remember the Missouri Compromise had already decided which states were free and which states were slaves. So this shows the difficulty that there was already disagreements and arguments with the Missouri Compromise, that it wasn't, people weren't happy with it anymore. And that brings the Compromise of 1850. Because the Missouri Compromise, people weren't happy with it. People, the South especially, didn't like how it gave all this new territory to not be, most of this area not to be slaves, to be free states. They tried to change things. And one thing is that California tries to become a state, right? So 1950, California tries to be a state. The gold rush had just happened in 1849. Sorry, not 1950, 1850. And California, half was in the north and half was in the south. So the Missouri Compromise line, if you look at this picture right here, kind of would have cut through right through California. So because of that, they really had to figure out what to do with this California. The reason why the South didn't want to admit it as a free state was because that they knew that they had, if California was given as a free states would now have more representation in Congress than slave states. And they didn't want that. They wanted to have, they wanted to keep the balance where there's an even number of free states and even number of slave states. So you already see this competition of jockeying for position, because each state wants to have the right amount of, wants to have more power in the national government and Congress than the other. So the slave and free want to be, have more than the other. And they don't want the other one getting too powerful, because then they feel the outlaw. They either make slavery legal everywhere, or they'll outlaw slavery for all. So each side is trying to keep it. So Henry Clay, who made the Missouri Compromise, now has to go to again to make a new deal. He works out this Compromise of 1850. And what happens is California is let in and is a free state. So California is let in as a free state, so no slavery allowed there. But New Mexico and Utah were allowed to have slaves, their territory. They weren't states yet. The territory was allowed to have slaves. So this was where slavery was allowed. But they also said, okay, if that happens, they're allowed to be slaves there. Then in Washington, D.C., which is all the way over here, we're going to say no slavery in D.C. So it's a compromise. It kind of works out. Everyone kind of is okay with it. It does give the North more power in Congress, but it does so while giving slavery allowed in Utah and New Mexico. So this idea that eventually these areas would become slave areas. And once again, this is kind of just ignoring what the Missouri Compromise line was supposed to be. It's kind of trying to find a workaround. And we'll see this Missouri Compromise line just gets thrown out the window in a little bit. But we'll see that later, not right now, which I knew before we did this. But that is it for today. Bye, guys. Have a great day. Oops.